So I'm curious, if you woke up tomorrow and your comic book collection was virtually worthless, and by virtually worthless, I mean actually worthless, how would that affect you today? How would that affect the things that you do today if you knew tomorrow your comics were going to be worth zero? That is the topic of today's vlog. I want to spend a little time in this vlog talking about that. Why? Because it is one of those things that I don't know that we've ever really thought about. And maybe you have thought about it in the back of your head, but I don't know that I've thought about my entire collection being worth zero. Like, there are books, yes, that I know are worthless. There are books that I've thought were worthless that turned out to actually be worth money because of retcons or because of some shadow or some tidbit or some nuance that was sprinkled in there that suddenly became relevant. And then all of a sudden, this book that I never bagged and boarded was all of a sudden worth money. And I'm kicking myself because I never actually put it in a bag or board. I never actually took care of it. It was in the back of the box in the last bin, and it was always like that red-headed stepchild. But I'm talking about in reverse. I'm talking about all the books that you and I spend good money on being worthless tomorrow. And it doesn't matter whether you paid $2 for a book or $200 or $2,000 or $200,000. And that's not really an exaggeration, because I do know people that have spent serious money on comics. I held $2 million worth of comics in my hand once, and I only had 2 books in my hands. That is just ridiculous. But let's just say that tomorrow you woke up and your entire collection that you have cultivated, you have cherished, you have protected, you have ushered from house to house, from childhood into adulthood. What would happen if that collection were worthless? How would that land on you? And this isn't a discussion of, do I think a crash is coming? That's not really what this is about, right? Because do I think a crash could happen? Yes. Do I think that is going to happen? I don't think so, but anything is possible, right? Corrections and market crashes are things that happen, and they've happened throughout history. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the Great Depression or the .com bubble in the late 90s, early 2000s, or the housing bubble. These things happen. These corrections, these booms and these busts are things that happen. But this is, to some degree, more of a philosophical kind of discussion that I'm trying to prompt here. And it's really this question of, what would happen if your comic book collection were actually worth nothing when you woke up tomorrow? How would you change things today? How would you change things after tomorrow, right? Would you still treasure these pieces of art? Would you still cultivate them? Would you still buy things to protect them? And would you still keep them in bins and boxes? Would you still pin them to walls to look at? Would you still appreciate them as works of art if they were worthless? And this isn't about, being right or wrong because you are in comics because there is money to be made. That's not really what this is about. It's just a question of, how would you behave differently? If at all. Maybe you still would read them and collect them and treasure them because you enjoy them, because they are an escape for you or have been an escape for you, and you still love them for what they provided you in your childhood. Many of you have shared these fantastic stories with me of how comics in years past have helped you through troubled times, whether it was a divorce of a parent or the death of a loved one or something like that. Comics were there for you. And the question is, if they weren't worth anything, would you still be there for them now? Especially after you've spent real money to buy them and to take care of them. It's an interesting question. If you take the time to think about it, it's an interesting question. Personally, I have always loved comics because I have enjoyed the stories and the escapism that comes along with comics. But in the back of my mind, I always knew that there were two types of comics. There were books that were worth something, and there were books that were worthless. And I've already talked about that, right? The books that were worthless were the ones that were in the very last half full comic book bin, or the fully full one that was crammed to the gills with all those books that I didn't really care about. And then there were the other books. There were the ones that always had a bag and board, had, they were in the number one box, that if a fire broke out, that was the box you grabbed and you got out of the house, right? There were those books. In my mind, there were always those two kinds of books. But one of the things that's interesting is that some of these books that were in the last bin are now in the first bin, right? These books that were once written off as being worthless are now worth something. And books that were worth something sometimes become books that are worthless. But what I'm talking about here is essentially an entire collection just being a big zero. Would you still love them the way that you loved them when they were worth something? Would you collect differently? Would you buy as many copies of books? Would you buy as many variants as you do? Would you still buy the books and never read them? Or would some of your habits shift as a result? Would you be a little more conservative with your dollars that you were spending? Would you buy a few less books? It's interesting, right? Think about it. It is an interesting thing. There are a lot of people that, and this is neither right nor wrong, there are a lot of people that buy comics as alternative investment options. And this is something that I've spoken about previously in other videos where I've talked about the comic book market and the market as a whole. Alternative investment options are things like real estate or gold or gems that people will buy when the economy gets bad. People with money will take their money and they will put them in things that are not losing value, right? Things like gold or gems or real estate for that matter, right? And there are some that have begun to look at comics as an alternative investment option because of how much money there is to be made in comics. And I don't know whether this is right or wrong, good or bad, right? But it happens. And so it'll be interesting to even see what happens with these people if comics start to take a dip and start to take a decline. Would they start pulling their money out of comics, out of blue chip comics, and put their money into something else? Something like gold, for example. I don't know. And then if that were to happen, if they were to pull their money out of comics, would comics start to take a little bit more of a tumble? And then what is the trickle down effect of that? That was just something that was kind of in the back of my mind as I began thinking about this video and this idea of comics being worthless. It was something that I was just kind of noodling, and I don't have it fully fleshed out. But it's one of those provocative things to kind of noodle, because one has to imagine that some of the comics that are being bought and sold on Heritage for these large dollar amounts, I don't know if they're individuals per se, regular comic book readers that are buying and selling these comics versus people that are putting their money into comics to kind of hold them there. In lieu of putting those dollars into something else. So what I'm talking about is not a comic book collector buying those books. I'm talking about someone else, an outsider, if you will, air quotes, an outsider. But this is all just a provocative thing to kind of think about, because yes, it is philosophical to think about and to pontificate what would happen if you woke up tomorrow and your comics were worthless. But could a comic book crash happen? Could a collapse happen? And would you see it coming? The people that were doing the .com and the housing bubbles, did they see it coming, or did it just happen? Would they have done things differently if they knew that it were coming? Do you think that they do you think that they wished that they could have done something differently as a result? I don't know. but something to think about. I want to thank you guys for taking the time to listen to this vlog and for just supporting the channel in general. You know, I want to thank you guys for that. If you need to reach out to me, feel free to do so at Regie Collects on Instagram and reggiecollects@gmail.com. I look forward to speaking with you soon.